Portugal, home to a population of a little over 10 million people and covering an area of just around 92,000 square kilometers. It's a nation whose rich culture and global influence far outweigh its size. Although known today primarily for its incredible wine and abundance of tourism, Portugal has long been a land defined by exploration and discovery. Just centuries ago, it stood at the heart of the first global empire, considered at one point as the richest country in the world, with vast colonial holdings stretching from Madeira to Mozambique to Macau. Yet today, this is no longer the case. Portugal in the 21st century, while certainly not poor by global standards, has fallen far behind its European neighbours. In 2021, its GDP per capita measured at around $24,000, the lowest value in Western Europe, trailing its Iberian neighbour Spain at just over $30,000, and dwarfed by other Western European nations like France and Germany. Additionally, in terms of its annual GDP growth rate, Portugal failed to outpace the euro area every year from 2000 to 2016, except for 2009 amidst the global financial crisis. Naturally, this begs the question: why is Portugal so comparatively poor? What is behind its historic fall from grace? And does it have the potential to regain its place among the great powers of the world? To make sense of Portugal's economic woes, it's necessary to go back and start at the beginning of the end of the Portuguese Empire. At its height, Portugal was a globe-spanning power with colonies across Africa, Asia, South America and Oceania. Financed by heaps of Brazilian gold and control of major trade routes, the Portuguese crown grew increasingly wealthy. However, like all empires do, it soon declined. By the middle of the 18th century, Portugal was falling behind its European contemporaries like Britain and the Netherlands. Matters only worsened. In 1755, a great earthquake struck Lisbon, demolishing the city, killing tens of thousands, and causing a tsunami that washed over the destruction. Half a century later, Portugal found itself racked by conflict. The War of the Oranges in 1801 and the Peninsular War in 1807 set it back further, with the loss of Brazil in 1822, dealing the final blow of this disastrous period. By the mid-19th century, the Portuguese Empire was clearly in decline, exhausted by war both at home and abroad, and being outcompeted by its powerful European neighbours. At this point, the government decided it needed to act. These next few decades, from 1851 to the 1890s, became known as the Regeneration. Only there was one slight problem. The Regeneration was a failure. The concept was simple. The government would funnel money into modernising the nation, allocating vast sums to construct roads, railways and telegraph networks, in the hopes that infrastructure development would help drive growth and economic prosperity. Financing this, however, meant taking on debt, and a lot of it. Portuguese public debt skyrocketed from about 30% of GDP in 1852 to 70% in the early 1880s. By the end of the century, Portugal was one of the most indebted countries in Europe. The idea, according to its chief architect, politician Antonio Fontes Pereira del Melo, was that the debt served as an investment. The resulting economic growth would eventually offset the rising deficit. Unfortunately, the work was chronically mismanaged, slow to deliver results, and ran over budget. It's also worth noting that during this period, Portugal's balance sheet relied heavily on remittances, payments or transfers from emigrants abroad. Millions of Portuguese citizens living in the colonies regularly sent money home, which helped support the home economy and pay debts. In 1889, however, after a military coup in Brazil, these remittances dried up, falling 90% between 1890 and 1891. This was a crisis. Unable to pay its debts or acquire international loans, the government was forced to default on its debt, abandon the gold standard, and forsake its project of modernization. This was a watershed moment for both the Portuguese economy and the state. Altogether, the story of the 19th century for Portugal was one of falling behind. While its European neighbours industrialised and integrated, Portugal entirely missed out on what is now known as the first age of globalisation, starting it down a path of decline and failure. The next few decades saw seismic political change. The Revolution of 1910 instituted Portugal's first republic, and the outbreak of World War I in 1914. But ultimately, it was more of the same for the Portuguese economy. It remained slow to industrialise and far less open than its peers, and continued to lose pace behind the rich countries of Western Europe. Then, in 1926, a military coup ended the republic. In financial disarray, The new government invited a distinguished economics professor from the local University of Coimbra to head the Ministry of Finance. His name was Antonio de Oliveira Salazar. Salazar would go on to lead Portugal as Prime Minister and rule the country as a dictator for much of the 20th century. Economically, Salazar believed in the principles of a balanced budget and monetary stability. He immediately acted to stabilize the currency and brought Portugal's debt under control. He was also quick to institute Estado Novo, the new state, a regime guided by the notion of corporatism. Corporatism can be understood as an ideology balanced between the free market capitalism and socialism, a balance of extensive state regulation with private ownership of the means of production. And for a time, it slightly improved the Portuguese economy. Employment in agriculture dropped slightly from 1925 to 1950, evidence of an increasing shift toward industry. But still, Portugal remained one of the least industrialized nations in Western Europe. The stifling protectionism of Estado Novo likely stalled progress and kept GDP growth low. From 1930 to 1945, it's estimated that the average growth of GDP per capita was quite limited, at only 1.1% per year. Yet, for once, better days lay ahead. Following international trends at the end of World War II, Portugal participated in many of the free trade developments taking place. It joined the Organization for European Economic Cooperation, the OEEC, receiving US aid through the Marshall Plan, and was a founding member of the European Free Trade Association, or EFTA, in 1960. It would also become a member of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, the GATT, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank. As a result of opening its economy, Portugal saw unprecedented growth during this period, so much so that it's commonly referred to as a golden age of economic growth. From 1950 to 1959, Portugal's annual GDP growth per capita averaged 3.9% and accelerated to 6.5% from the years of 1960 to 1973. At the same time, both industry and services grew rapidly as the Portuguese economy urbanized and industrialized. This golden age is worth mentioning in part because it serves as an example of what Portugal should have been doing for decades. While its key mistake throughout the 19th century likely was overburdening itself with debt it couldn't pay off, it can be argued that Portugal's central mistake of the early 1900s was its deeply protectionist attitude. Not all scholars are in total agreement, but regardless, this period made very clear the failings of the early Estado Novo system. The prosperity wouldn't last. In 1973, the global economy was rocked by the OPEC oil embargo, which caused gas prices to increase worldwide. This put the economies of Europe in shaky territory for sure, but a year later, Portugal would undergo its own crisis. On April 25, 1974, revolution struck. The Carnation Revolution returned democracy to Portugal, doing away with the Estado Novo regime and ending Portugal's colonial wars in Africa. Unfortunately, negative economic growth, driven by nationalization of industry, capital flight and increased unemployment, came with these changes. Unemployment had been virtually non-existent in 1973, but quickly jumped to 6.2%, and in the wake of the political turmoil, many of the country's youngest and brightest left the country, a brain drain that would have long-lasting repercussions. Whereas Portugal had seen rates of GDP per capita growth of 11% and 10.3% in 1971 and 1972 respectively. 1975, on the other hand, saw a drastic minus 9.2% contraction instead. The golden age of growth in Portugal was over. The next major shift took place in 1986, the start of what some refer to as the European period of Portugal's economic history. From 1986 until the turn of the millennium, Portuguese GDP growth outpaced that of the euro area, likely a direct result of its accession to the European Economic Community, the precursor to the European Union. However, like the rapid growth of the 50s and 60s, this bout of prosperity did not last long. The Portuguese slump of the early 2000s, followed by the European debt crisis in 2009, brings us to the final key point behind Portugal's mediocre economic standing: capital misallocation. From 2000 until 2007, real GDP per capita only increased 4.3% over the period, just 0.6% a year on average. To be sure, lower rates of higher education and a general inability to compete in world trade markets, made worse by renewed competition from Eastern Europe and China, put Portugal at a disadvantage. But despite large amounts of capital flowing into the country, the economy barely grew. Due to the weakness of Portugal's financial sector, these capital inflows were misallocated to an unproductive non-tradable sector, as opposed to tradable goods and manufacturing, and the net result was not only a slumping economy, but one particularly exposed to the European debt crisis that would sweep the continent starting in 2009. 2 years later, in 2011, Portugal would request and receive an IMF EU bailout to the tune of €78 billion to stabilise its economy. Unemployment would peak at 16.2% in 2013, marking the height of the economic catastrophe. So why is Portugal poor? As we've seen, it comes down to costly policy mistakes, untenable debt, excessive protectionism, capital misallocation, among a few others, at critical junctures in its history, leading to situations wherein once it falls behind, it finds itself unable to catch back up. However, on a brighter note, while key economic challenges remain, since 2014, Portugal's recovery has actually been proceeding quite well. In the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic economic fallout, tourism has rebounded sharply, as has the Portuguese economy, and Portugal seems poised to be less affected by the ongoing Ukraine war than other European nations. Early reports even estimate that Portugal's GDP grew by 6.7% in 2022, the second highest among EU nations. All in all, Portugal surely has a long way to go if it wants to regain its place among the great economic countries of the world. However, as a nation with a rich history of innovation and creativity, I certainly wouldn't count them out.